The quiet of the provincial town was deceptive. Life here flowed slowly, but in its depths lay dark secrets that were best left unspoken. The town of Riverside, lost somewhere in the southern states, lived by its own rules. Everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were not trusted. Wealthy families held power in their hands. The police turned a blind eye to inconvenient incidents, and justice was not for everyone. In this town lived Cassie Walker, a 16-year-old orphan, raised by her grandfather, James Walker. After the death of her parents, she had to grow up too soon. She didn't wear fashionable clothes, didn't chase trendy phones, and didn't dream of a life full of adventures. She just wanted to be invisible, to study, and not bother anyone. But it was precisely those like her who were most often chosen as victims. Her grandfather, who was her support. James Walker was a man of the old school. A former military man who had seen wars, he was strict but fair. His granddaughter was his pride, the only thread that connected him to this world. He knew the world was cruel, and he taught her to defend herself. "You don't owe anyone anything, Cassie," he would say. "If someone touches you, hit back." But how do you hit back when the attackers are stronger, when they have connections, when you are up against the son of a judge and the nephew of the mayor? Trevor Miller and Lance Carter were those who could get away with anything in town. They were used to teachers turning a blind eye to their antics and parents solving any problems for them. The guys enjoyed their power, playing with the lives of those who were weaker. At first, it was small acts of meanness, broken things, mocking notes in textbooks, accidental trips in the hallways. Teachers preferred not to notice. Classmates remained silent. Cassie tried to just ignore them, hoping they would lose interest in her. But they didn't lose interest. They were just getting started. That day was hot. After physical education class, Cassie stayed in the locker room longer than the others. She wanted to catch her breath a bit before going back out into a world full of stares and whispers. She didn't even hear the door close. "Well, orphan, are you bored?" A familiar voice sounded. Cassie turned around and saw them, Trevor and Lance. The door was locked. Her first instinct was to run, to scream. But to whom? There was almost no one left in the school, and even if someone heard, what would change? They were confident in their impunity. "Don't look at us like that," Lance sneered, taking a step closer. Trevor silently closed the latch. She couldn't even scream. They did everything quickly, cruelly, without hesitation. When it was all over, Cassie just lay on the cold floor. Trevor zipped up his jacket, glanced at her, and sneered. "Just try telling someone. No one will believe you." Lance laughed and kicked her with his sneaker. "Thanks for the show, Cass." They left, leaving her lying in silence. She didn't cry. She just stared at the ceiling. But something inside her broke. That night, she didn't return home. She sat by the river, looking at the dark water, and thought about whether she should just step forward. James found her at dawn. "What happened?" he asked. She turned away. He sat down next to her, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and didn't rush her. "You know I won't leave until you tell me." But she couldn't tell him. She knew he would go to sort it out. But what could her grandfather do against power, money, and the system? She just shook her head. "I don't want to live anymore." And those were the only words she spoke. The grandfather's anger. James Walker was not a sentimental man. He knew that this world was unfair. He had seen evil go unpunished. But he was not going to let it happen to his granddaughter. That night, for the first time in many years, he opened an old trunk. Inside were his medals, faded photographs, and something else. His fingers ran over the cold metal, and he slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke. He was old, but he was not weak. And if this town refused to punish the guilty, he would do it himself. Trevor Miller and Lance Carter were sure they had gotten away with it. They were used to the world around them bending to their will, to their family name opening doors and closing mouths. They were not afraid of consequences because they had never experienced them. They thought Cassie Walker was just another broken girl who would keep silent. But they didn't know one thing. They didn't know that Cassie had a grandfather. James Walker was a man of the old school. A veteran of war, a former Marine sergeant, he had lived a life where there was no room for pity or compromise. His world was simple. If you are attacked, you fight back. If you are hurt, you return the pain. That night, when Cassie finally told him the truth, He was silent for a long time. Then he slowly stood up, walked to an old cabinet, and took out a worn black box. It smelled of dust and years, of memories he had long wanted to forget. Cassie looked at him with concern. "Grandpa, you won't tell anyone anything?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'll take care of it myself." She knew that tone. She knew that look. And she was scared. The next morning, James went into town. He walked down the main streets, stopped by a coffee shop where locals discussed the latest news, and looked into a barber shop where men chatted about sports games. He didn't ask anything directly. He just listened. And soon he knew everything he needed to know. Trevor Miller took his father's Dodge Challenger for a spin every morning, playing the tough guy. Lance Carter went to the gym, but often stayed late to take selfies in the locker room. They felt like they owned the world. They didn't even know they were being hunted. Meanwhile, Cassie lived in anticipation. School had become a nightmare for her. Every step down the hallway was accompanied by stares. Every smile was fake. She felt it, the smug confidence that they had won, that she would keep silent. But there was something else. She noticed changes. Trevor started to get nervous. He checked his phone more often, looked over his shoulder. Lance no longer laughed as loudly as before. Their hands started to shake when someone mentioned her grandfather's name. They knew. They knew that James Walker was not just an old man. They knew that he was the man who had once found and destroyed people who had done something similar in a distant land, under the scorching sun. They didn't know the details, but rumors circulated. Rumors that once someone tried to rob James's house. That 3 days later, that someone was found in the river with a stone around his neck. Rumors that Cassie's grandfather had his own methods. And now they were afraid. But it was too late. Cassie didn't know what her grandfather was planning. She didn't want to know. But deep down, she understood. Whatever happened next would change their lives forever. James Walker watched. He didn't rush. He knew that revenge was a dish best served cold. He spent several days studying the daily routines of Trevor Miller and Lance Carter. They lived carefree lives, confident that the world belonged to them. But now their lives had turned into a hunt. Only they didn't know yet that they had become the prey. Trevor was the first. One evening, he left the gym later than usual. No one was around. The town was falling asleep. The streets were deserted. He was walking to his car when he heard footsteps behind him. "Hey, kid." Trevor turned around. In front of him stood an old man. Not just any old man. James Walker's eyes looked cold, assessing, as if he had already decided his fate. Trevor nervously swallowed. "What do you want?" James was silent. Then he took a step forward. "You know why I'm here." Trevor froze. His chest tightened uncomfortably. A chill ran down his spine. "Listen, if this is about Cassie." He didn't get to finish. James grabbed him by the collar and forcefully pinned him against the wall. "Did you think this would all be forgotten? That you would get away with it?" Trevor tried to break free, but the old man's grip was like iron. "Old man, what are you doing? Back off or You'll what?" James leaned in closer. His voice became a threatening whisper. "Complain to your daddy? Say that a war veteran scared you? You're used to everyone being afraid of your family. But now you will be the one who is afraid." Trevor breathed rapidly, his shoulders tensed. Shoo. James released him so abruptly that Trevor hit his back against the wall. "This is just a warning." Trevor didn't move. His body was shaking. James looked at him with contempt and turned away. But Trevor knew. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. Lance Carter was next. He was walking down an alley when someone suddenly grabbed his shoulder. A sharp tug, and he found himself face to face with James Walker. "You. Quiet." James squeezed his neck so hard that Lance was gasping for air. "Did you think you could just go on living?" "Grandpa, let go." You're crazy." James pressed him harder against the wall. "You broke my granddaughter. Now it's your turn to know fear." Lance shrank back, his eyes darting around. I. You won't say anything. Because you're a coward." James released him, and Lance fell to his knees, gasping for air. "Remember, kid, I'm always nearby." And he left, leaving Lance shaking with fear. They didn't tell anyone. They didn't complain. But Cassie saw the changes. Trevor no longer laughed. Lance no longer cast sidelong glances. They had started to fear. But fear was just the beginning, and it would get worse. Trevor Miller and Lance Carter lived in constant fear. Their once carefree and entitled lives had turned into endless paranoia. Every morning began with anxious glances over their shoulders. Every evening ended in empty streets where they felt they were being watched. They couldn't prove it. They couldn't tell anyone. Because who would believe them? What would they say? That an old man was stalking them? But this old man was not just any elderly person. He was James Walker, a man who knew how to make his victim break without spilling a drop of blood. He didn't attack them physically. He didn't threaten them. He was just there. And that was enough. One night, Trevor Miller heard something strange. At first, it was a rustling outside the window. Then the muffled sound of footsteps. He lay in bed, his heart pounding. Then his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Are you scared?" Trevor jumped out of bed, staring at the screen. His fingers trembled as he typed a response. "Who is this?" In response, he received a photo. The picture showed his house, taken from outside, in the dark of night. Trevor rushed to the window. No one was there, but he knew someone had been there. Someone was watching. Lance Carter tried to hold on. He told himself that it was all in his head, that the old man just wanted to scare them but wouldn't do anything. But fear gnawed at him from within. One evening, he returned home. He climbed the stairs, inserted the key into the lock, and realized the door was open. His heart stopped. Lance slowly entered. The room was dark. He took a step forward and noticed it. On the table lay a note, an ordinary scrap of paper, written in a neat, confident hand. "Confess, or I'll come for you." Lance grabbed the note, crumpled it. His body was shaking. He turned around and suddenly felt like someone was standing in the darkness of the room. He screamed, but there was no one there, only fear. The next day, Cassie noticed the changes. Trevor and Lance no longer laughed. They no longer whispered behind her back. On the contrary, they avoided her. Trevor flinched when someone said his name. Lance flinched when someone simply touched his shoulder. And most importantly, they no longer looked confident. They looked like every step they took could be their last. Cassie didn't know the details, but she knew one thing. Her grandfather had made his final move, and Trevor and Lance were already falling into the abyss. A week had passed since Trevor Miller and Lance Carter began living in constant fear. But fear is not just an emotion. Fear is a poison that eats away at the mind, making one see threats where there may be none. Trevor no longer went out alone in the evenings. He locked his doors with 2 locks, kept a bat under his bed, and jumped at every sound. He barely slept. Lance started avoiding social media, avoiding friends, even avoiding his own family. He no longer went to the gym. He was afraid of empty hallways, empty alleys, empty streets. But the most terrifying thing was that they both knew. All of this was not just their imagination. James Walker was somewhere nearby, and he was waiting. That evening, Trevor was driving home in his car. He checked his rearview mirrors several times. No one was there. He turned onto his street and saw him. James Walker was standing on the sidewalk right in front of his house. Just standing there, not moving, not doing anything. But his gaze was cold and empty, as if he was looking not at a person, but at someone already doomed. Trevor froze. What should he do? Turn around and drive away? Call the police? But what would he say? That an old man was following him? That a veteran who might just be out for an evening stroll was scaring him? Trevor gripped the steering wheel. His hands were sweating. Then James took a step forward. Trevor jerked and, without thinking, hit the gas. The car lurched forward. He turned onto another street, drove out of the neighborhood. His heart was pounding in his chest. Only after half an hour did he realize that he was driving somewhere. He had run away. From the old man. From himself. And for the first time in a long time, Trevor Miller realized that he was not in control of the situation. He was the victim. That same evening, Lance Carter sat in his room, nervously pressing the buttons on his phone. He didn't know who to call. The police? No. His father? He wouldn't even look his way. Trevor? He would just say that Lance was going crazy. But he wasn't going crazy, because there was another note on his door. Tomorrow will be your last chance. Lance sat, clutching the note in his hand. What did that mean? What the hell did last chance mean? Maybe tomorrow he wouldn't wake up. When Cassie came to school the next day, everything was different. Trevor wasn't there. Lance was sitting in his seat, but he didn't look like himself. He was pale. His hands were shaking. He was staring at one spot. Cassie didn't know all the details, but she felt that something was about to happen. She just didn't know who would break first. Lance Carter hadn't slept for the second night in a row. He was completely exhausted. After the last note, his mind finally cracked. He hadn't eaten, hadn't left the house, had turned off his phone. His father came by a few times, asking what was going on. But Lance couldn't explain anything. How could he tell him that an old man who hadn't touched him even once was already ruining his life? How could he explain that fear had become an integral part of his consciousness? That night, he lay in the darkness and suddenly heard a sound. Footsteps. Not in the house. Outside. They were slow, measured, like a hunter's. Lance slid out of bed and tiptoed to the window. He looked out. On the other side of the street stood James Walker, and he was looking straight at him. Just looking. Lance quickly closed the curtains. Then he opened them again. The old man was gone. But Lance knew. It wasn't a hallucination. He was here. He was nearby. And tomorrow it would all end. Trevor Miller was sure. He was on the edge. He spent the whole night in his car, not daring to go home. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw him. That gaze. That cold, calm gaze, full of something he couldn't explain. He knew that the old man hadn't done anything, but that was worse than if he had done something. Fear wouldn't let him sleep, wouldn't let him breathe. And then he realized he had to do something first, before the old man did it himself. He came to school with a blank stare. Lance was already there, and he looked the same as Trevor. When the bell rang, Trevor slowly stood up from his seat. I have to say something. The classroom fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. We did something we shouldn't have. Lance froze. Cassie looked up. Trevor took a deep breath. Two police officers entered the classroom. Trevor Miller. Lance Carter. Lance turned pale. Trevor felt the world crumbling around him. Someone had talked. On the school porch, watching as the police led the two young men away, he stood calmly. He hadn't done anything illegal. He hadn't touched them. He had just made sure the truth came out. And the rest was up to the system. He knew that money could get them out of the worst trouble, but they would never feel invincible again. They would never live without fear again. James turned around and walked home. The job was done. Cassie stood on the school porch, watching as the police took Trevor Miller and Lance Carter away. She didn't know what she should feel. Joy? Relief? No, only emptiness. She thought this moment should have been the end of the nightmare. But why did it still feel like it wasn't over? Why did it still feel like something was squeezing inside her? Why did it feel like this was still not the end? She watched as one of the officers closed the patrol car door. For a moment, her gaze met Lance's. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared.